our spiritual values this month. And the talk title for today is God Comes Through the Wound. God comes through the wound. You know, the Buddha said, pain is inevitable, but suffering is not. Pain is a part of life. That's why we have all these nerve endings and things. It tells us, ooh, don't touch the flame, stop that. The body is telling us things about what's going on with us. But suffering is something where we regenerate the pain in our mind. And we do that really effectively. We do that so well. But there is a song by John Aston that I love, and it says, "The heart that is breaking is but opening again." The heart that is breaking is but opening again. So I remember being 20, living in Manhattan Beach, California. I lived a block from the beach. I worked for an airline. I was living the life. But I had a boyfriend. He was in the Army. He'd been drafted. It was Vietnam War time. And he had been drafted, and he was stationed in Hawaii, which was perfect because he was a surfer. So he ended up in Hawaii. And so I got a Dear Jane letter, where they talk about Dear John letters, but they have Dear Janes too. He was having a great old time in Hawaii, and it was like, because I was ready to just jump on a plane and go to be with him, and he was like, maybe not. So what I ended up doing was moving. I moved back to the Bay Area, and I ended up quitting the job and going back to school and getting a degree at the University of California, and getting gassed by Ronald Reagan and the helicopters and all that kind of fun stuff. But that's another story. But anyway, so there was a wound, and yet it opened me to something greater, this degree. And a little later, I was working in San Francisco, and my sister was killed in an automobile accident. And she was younger than I was. She was 20. I was 24. And it was like not right. Your baby sister should not be dying before you do. And of course, my parents were both devastated. And that made me think how precious and unpredictable life is. We can take nothing for granted. And I was working as a service representative in San Francisco at the time, which means that I was dealing with people who were complaining about their bills. And so I would have somebody calling up and say, there's this 3-cent charge on my bill, and what is it, and da-da-da. And I would put them on hold, and I would say, how important is this in relationship to your death? Had to get a little perspective there. But then I would do my job and take the charge, tell them who it was, and take the charge off or whatever needed to happen. But, it's sort of like, do you really want to get so upset and release all these stress chemicals into your body over this? Really? Is it really that important? I had a hard time making that shift. So the wound continues to open us. The wounding continues to shift us and to change us. I mean, the reason I came to Grass Valley was that my partner of 35 years had died. And with him no longer there in the Bay Area, it was like, okay, I'm free to go anywhere. I could go wherever God calls me. I'm ready to go. Because I thought, okay, my life is over. I give my life to God. Well, giving your life to God, it turns out to be much better than mine. It was great. you think, because I came from a Catholic background, I was thinking, martyrdom. They're going to crucify me, No, 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 no. When you give your life to God, God wants joy. God wants love. God wants our fullest expression of who we are. So that opened me up. That wound opened me up again to a greater experience of, I couldn't have ever imagined what my life would be like when I moved here. It was, yeah, I know. Thank you. Well, it was all a God thing. It's all a God thing. So, but the thing is, what we think is very important. We were talking about what we think, and what we think about what we think is important. I have a little sign in my office that says, think before you think. Because our thinking is extremely important. So our book this month is Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And last week we talked about how people could know things without knowing why they knew it. They just knew. And that was the way it was supposed to be. They just knew. They talked about a tennis coach, and he could watch a game and he knew before the player hit the tennis ball that it was going to be a double fault. And if you asked him how he knew, he was trying to figure it out. How do I know that? But he couldn't figure out if it was, the way that he held the ball, the way that he stood, the way that he stepped. He couldn't figure it out, but he just knew. He just knew, and we talked about being connected to that infinite mind within that knows everything. And so he also explains in this book that this ability to know, to make a snap judgment in the blink of an eye, also has a downside. Because we're not only connected to that infinite mind of God, but we're connected to the consciousness of the human race, the collective unconscious, subjective mind. All the thoughts that everyone has ever thought are in this subjective mind that we're a part of. And in psychology, they understand that we have this other stuff going on. They call it implicit awareness, or implicit associations. Implicit associations. And so, for instance, they have a test that you can take. implicitharvard.edu. You can take this test. And what it does is it has like women's names and men's names, and you're just supposed to check, is this a female name or a male name? Just you start there. And then it goes through all these different things, and then it picks up associations that we have with African Americans or, other people that are strange to us, and how that impacts us in terms of our ability to think of them in positive ways. And they had this one student who would take this test every day, and he was just he still had these implicit associations of negativity with African Americans. Then one day he took the test, and he didn't have such a negative association. And he couldn't figure out why. Why did that change? Because he watched the Olympics that morning, and he got to have a positive association with African Americans. So he did better. So we have these unconscious associations going on in us. And he talks about President Warren Harding. Now, President Warren Harding was a tall man. He was impressive. He was handsome. They called him Roman. He had this look to him. He looked authoritative. He looked the part of whatever office he was running for. He looked like a leader should look in our minds. However, as he liked to, he wasn't a particularly intelligent man. He liked to smoke, drink, gamble, and chase women. and apparently he was legend in chasing women. As he rose through the political ranks, he never once distinguished himself. He was vague and ambivalent on matters of policy. He was absent for major votes on things like suffrage. And his speeches were described as an army of pompous phrases moving over the landscape in search of an idea. He was elected president because he looked presidential. He was elected president because he looked presidential. And most historians agree he was one of the worst presidents we've ever had.
So far.
But we survived. We survived. Although he didn't. He actually died in office of a stroke. So Gladwell gives us several examples of things where we think we have free will and we really don't, because we have these implicit associations. They give what's called a scrambled sentence test. Okay, it has 5 words in it, and you're to make a 4-word sentence. So they have things like, let's see, him was worried she always. Him was worried she always, that's one of them. Then there was another was, from our Florida oranges temperature. Okay, and then you have to just make a sentence out of it. So you could make, she always worried him. There's a sentence. And then oranges are from Florida. Okay? But the thing you don't know is that they have embedded in the 10 sentences words like Florida, worried, old, lonely, gray, bingo, and wrinkled. And what they discovered was, after you take this test, you walk slower out of the room because you feel older. Because they have unconsciously implanted these feelings of being older in us. So they did another test, and they did these sentences. With one group, the words were like polite or, conscientious. Let's see, they would have considerate, patient, yield. Those were the words that were embedded for one group. And the other group, they had words like bold, aggressive, bother, disturb, intrude. So they were to complete these tests, these sentences, and then they were to go and talk to the experimenter about what their next assignment was. Well, when they finished doing the tests, they would go to the experimenter, only he was always talking to someone else. So the test was, who's going to interrupt first? Is it the rude people, or is it going to be the polite people? Does that have an impact on who gets interrupted? Now, the university, before approving this, said, you have to only let this go for 10 minutes. You can't let them stand there listening to you guys talk for more than 10 minutes. And they said, these guys are from New York. They're going to wait a minute max. Well, it turned out that the people who got all the rude words took an average of 5 minutes to interrupt. And 82% of the people who had the polite and courteous and patient words embedded, 82% of them never interrupted. Unconscious implantations of ideas that allowed people to demonstrate different behavior and not understand why. They couldn't have told you why they waited so long to interrupt, because it was unconscious. They also had a board game, and you could only win if you cooperated. So they primed them again with a little test where they embedded all these cooperative words, and sure enough, when they played the game, they won because they cooperated. But when they asked them, did you feel like you were cooperating? Did you feel more cooperative? It was like, no, they had no idea that that was going on in them. They had no idea that that had been planted in their implicit associations. So, the other good news about this is just because something's out of our awareness doesn't mean it's outside of our control. Just because something's outside of our awareness doesn't mean it's outside of our control. We can change what we think. We can realize a greater truth for ourselves. And this is one of the purposes of affirmations. We have these affirmations that we create in order to implant what we really want to experience rather than what might be in there because of the race consciousness, because of this collective unconsciousness. So we're willing to plant new thoughts. I am peace. I am love. I am accepting. I am intelligent. I am competent, calm, connected, whatever. Whatever we say after I am, we are declaring the power of God in us. So, I happened to be reading another book while I was reading this one. It's You Are the Placebo. And in that, they talk about You Are the Placebo. They talk about an experiment that went on in 1981 where they took 8 70 and 80-year-old men to a monastery for a week. What they asked of them was to imagine or pretend that they were 22 years younger, at least 22 years younger than they were. To pretend that they were at least 22 years younger than they were. And when they went to this monastery, all they had was stuff from 1959. They had Life magazine, they had Saturday Evening Post, they were listening to Perry Como, they were listening to Nat King Cole, they were watching TV series and movies from 1959. After 1 week of being up there in that environment where they were like in a little time capsule, thinking that they were younger, by all measurements, they were younger. They grew taller, they improved in height, weight, and gait. Their postures straightened, their joints became more flexible, their fingers lengthened as their arthritis diminished, their hearing and eyesight got better. They improved their scores on mental cognition by 83%. They literally became younger because they changed how they thought of themselves. And because they had changed how they thought of themselves, their body chemistry changed. Their body chemistry changed. And it didn't just change their minds, it changed their bodies. We sometimes tend to think that bad things will last longer than good things because the bad things feel so bad. And so the time sort of expands. But we have to remember that, it's an experience that we're having. We get to apply the meaning to it. We get to decide if it's really bad or good, or if it's just an experience that we're having that will pass and that we will get through. We have a lot of people who talk about the end times. Some people think that there are folks who are really conspiring for war in the Middle East because that's where it's been foretold that we will have the end times. Honey, the end times have been happening all the time. End times are when things change, and things are always changing. People who got lost their goods or their families or whatever in the floods and the tornadoes that have just happened. That's an end time. And so we have to remember, for every end time, there's a beginning time. That God is in the wound. That when we get into a wounded place, when we get into a painful place, we tend to think God isn't there. God is always there. The only thing that thinks God is not there is our own thought. And God is all-powerful, and God is love, and in God, all things are possible. In love, all things are possible. So we have to remember that in the midst of everything. There's a wonderful group called Stowe and Good, and they sing a song called Beautiful Brokenness. And in that song, they talk about beautiful brokenness, love will always win. Beautiful brokenness, that's how the light gets in. And somehow being broken has made me whole. There is an art in Japan called kintsugi. When you break a vase in Japan, you do not throw it away. You put it back together with gold and silver and platinum lacquer so that it becomes even more beautiful than it was before. We can repair our wounds with love and bring forth something more beautiful, more whole, more powerful, more strong, if we choose. If we choose. In The Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes said, "The mind is the creative factor within us. And when the mind takes its pattern after the spirit, it automatically renews the outer person after true holiness or wholeness." So, let us do our affirmation. I am secure in God through all the changes in my life. I am secure in God through all the changes in my life. I am secure in God through all the changes in my life. I am secure in God through all the changes in my life. And so it is.